A black teacher, fresh from winning a prestigious educator's award, walks into a downtown coffee shop to celebrate with friends. He orders his usual and waits by the counter, his mind buzzing with excitement about the recognition he's finally earned. But everything changes when a security guard approaches. His tone sharp, his intent clear. Without reason, he accuses the teacher of loitering, demands to see a receipt, and escalates the situation in front of a stunned crowd. What happens next? Just 7 minutes later, the teacher is removed from the shop, humiliated, and told to leave or face arrest. What the guard and onlookers don't realize is that the teacher has spent years teaching his students how to navigate and challenge a world riddled with bias. And today, he's about to put those lessons into action in a way that will shock everyone and spark a conversation no one saw coming. Stay with me, because this is a story you need to hear. Before we dive in, comment below and let us know where you're watching from. And if you find stories about resilience and justice inspiring, don't forget to like and subscribe for more. It was just an ordinary Friday afternoon in a bustling downtown cafe. But for one man, it was the beginning of something extraordinary. The morning light broke through the heavy clouds, casting an uneven glow on the streets of Charleston. The city was waking up, coffee shops buzzing, buses grumbling along their routes, and shopkeepers flipping signs from closed to open. In the middle of this morning's choreography, Henry Sullivan walked with purpose. His faded leather briefcase bumped against his thigh, a companion as worn and steady as the path he tread daily to his job at the bank. To the casual observer, Henry was unremarkable, a tall, lean black man in his 40s. His movements precise, his expression reserved, but to those who looked closer, there was a quiet weight in his eyes. A story of navigating spaces where he was often the only one who looked like him. The bank on King Street was a stately building, all polished brass and marble floors. A place meant to impress and intimidate. Henry had worked there for 15 years, starting as a teller and rising to assistant branch manager. It wasn't an easy climb. The murmured doubts, the subtle sidelong glances, and the conversations that paused when he entered the room had built a wall of quiet resistance. He scaled it, brick by brick, with competence that couldn't be ignored and a patience honed by years of practice. As he walked through the grand entrance, the sound of his footsteps echoed across the marble floor. He greeted his colleagues with nods and polite smiles. Some returned the gestures warmly, while others barely acknowledged him, their indifference veiled behind the hum of busyness. The morning unfolded predictably: emails, meetings, and routine transactions. But just before lunch, an unfamiliar tension crept into the air. A commotion stirred near the main counter. A customer, a middle-aged white man in a tailored suit, was raising his voice at a young teller named Maria. She was new, nervous, and struggling to keep her composure. "I don't care about your policies," the man barked. "I need this withdrawal approved now." Henry stepped in, his voice calm but firm. "Good morning, sir. Let's see if we can resolve this together." The man turned to Henry, his eyes narrowing as they scanned him up and down. "And who are you?" "Assistant branch manager," Henry replied, his tone measured. "Great," the man said, his sarcasm sharp enough to cut. "Then maybe you can explain why I'm being treated like this." Henry reviewed the account details Maria had pulled up. "It looks like the withdrawal exceeds the daily limit, but we can authorize it with proper identification." The man scoffed. "Proper identification? What is this? A courtroom?" The exchange continued, the man growing louder, his disdain bubbling to the surface. Henry remained composed, guiding the conversation back to the policy and working to de-escalate the situation. Finally, the man relented, throwing his ID onto the counter with a muttered, "Figures." As Henry processed the request, he felt the weight of the room's attention. Customers and colleagues alike were watching, their expressions a mixture of curiosity, unease, and something more insidious, a silent question about whether Henry's presence had escalated the situation rather than resolved it. After the man stormed out with his cash, Maria whispered, "Thank you, Mr. Sullivan." Henry nodded, offering her a reassuring smile. But the encounter lingered. He knew the man's hostility wasn't just about the policy. It rarely was. At lunch, Henry sat alone in the break room, his sandwich untouched. The morning's events replayed in his mind. The man's contempt, the looks from his colleagues. He had navigated moments like this before, but each one left a mark. a quiet reminder of the barriers that still stood. As the clock ticked toward the afternoon rush, Henry straightened his tie, adjusted his jacket, and prepared to step back into the fray. The marble floors gleamed under the fluorescent lights, reflecting a world that looked pristine on the surface but carried fractures just beneath. Henry knew those fractures well. They weren't loud or overt, but they were there, in the way people hesitated to meet his eyes, in the extra steps he had to take to prove himself, in the silent calculations of where he did and didn't belong. As he returned to his desk, the day stretched ahead like a well-worn path, but beneath the surface of routine, the quiet tension of those fractures hummed, waiting for the next moment when they would crack just enough to remind him they were still there. By early afternoon, the bank hummed with activity, the rhythmic clicks of keyboards blending with the low murmur of conversations and the occasional clatter of coins in the cash drawers. Henry Sullivan stood at the edge of the conference room, his posture straight, his briefcase clasped tightly in one hand. Inside, the branch's senior staff gathered for their weekly meeting, their voices spilling into the corridor in bursts of laughter and confident chatter. Henry entered with quiet purpose, taking his seat near the middle of the long oak table. The room was a tableau of power dynamics. Mr. Grayson, the branch manager, sat at the head of the table, his silver hair gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Surrounding him were the other department heads, their tailored suits and expensive watches a silent badge of their authority. The meeting began, as always, with Mr. Grayson's updates on the bank's quarterly goals and upcoming initiatives. Henry listened intently, taking notes and nodding occasionally. His presence in these meetings was routine now, but the room often felt like a stage where he was both performer and audience, careful to play his role while watching every move of those around him. As the agenda shifted to a discussion about the bank's declining customer satisfaction scores, Grayson leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled. "We need innovative ideas to address this," he said, his tone carrying the weight of expectation. Henry's hand hovered over his notebook. He had prepared a detailed proposal, one he had worked on for weeks. It outlined ways to streamline customer interactions and improve staff training, all while fostering a more inclusive environment. He had poured his experience and insight into it, knowing it was a risk to speak up but feeling the urgency of its importance. When the floor opened for suggestions, Henry cleared his throat. "I have some thoughts on how we might approach this," he began, his voice steady but firm. All eyes turned to him, a mix of curiosity and skepticism. He shared his proposal, outlining the key points with clarity and precision. He spoke about the need to address unconscious biases in customer service, the importance of making every customer feel valued, and the potential long-term benefits of these changes. As he finished, a brief silence hung in the air before Grayson spoke. "Interesting," he said, his tone measured, "but I'm not sure this aligns with our immediate goals. We need quick wins, not an overhaul of our processes." Across the table, a junior manager, Brad, leaned forward with a smirk. "Yeah, it sounds a bit idealistic, don't you think? Customers don't care about inclusivity. They just want faster service and fewer mistakes." A ripple of quiet laughter spread around the table, and Henry felt the familiar heat of dismissal creep up his neck. He held his ground, meeting Grayson's gaze, respectfully. "Mr. Grayson, I believe these changes will address the root causes of dissatisfaction. Faster service is important, but how we treat people matters just as much, if not more." Grayson sighed, glancing at his watch. "It's a compelling argument, Sullivan, but we're short on time. Let's circle back to this later." The conversation moved on, but Henry's proposal lingered in the air, unspoken but not unnoticed. He knew the dismissal wasn't just about time or priorities. It was about him, about the way his voice often carried less weight in rooms like these. As the meeting adjourned, the attendees filed out, their chatter filling the hallway. Brad clapped Henry on the back, his grin overly familiar. "Don't take it personally, Sullivan. You know how Grayson is. Practical to a fault." Henry smiled tightly, his grip on his briefcase firm. "Sure, Brad," he replied, his tone even. Returning to his desk, Henry stared at his notes, the careful lines of his proposal feeling heavier now. He knew his ideas had merit, but in that room, they had been diminished, reduced to an afterthought. Later that afternoon, as he stepped out to grab a coffee, Henry felt the weight of the day pressing on him. The world outside the bank buzzed with its own rhythm, but the tension from the meeting clung to him like a second skin. At the corner coffee shop, he stood in line behind a white woman in a tailored blazer. Her phone pressed to her ear. When it was her turn, she ordered without glancing at the barista. Her tone curt. "Latte. Extra foam. No sugar," she snapped before stepping aside, still engrossed in her call. When Henry approached the counter, the barista, a young white man with a name tag that read Elliot, greeted him with a tight smile. "Can I help you?" "Just a black coffee, please," Henry said, reaching for his wallet. Elliot hesitated, his eyes flicking to the register. "We have premium blends," he said, his tone oddly cautious. "Are you sure that's all you want?" Henry looked at him for a moment, the question hanging between them. "Black coffee's fine," he replied, his voice cool, as he stepped aside to wait for his order. The woman with the latte glanced at him briefly before returning to her phone. It was a small moment, insignificant to anyone else, but to Henry, it carried the same quiet message he had felt in the meeting. "Are you sure you belong here?" When his coffee was ready, he thanked the barista and stepped back onto the street. The city moved around him, busy and indifferent, its rhythms as relentless as ever. Henry walked back to the bank, the coffee warm in his hand but the quiet tension of the day lingering. A reminder of the invisible walls he navigated every day. By evening, the bank had emptied, and the office lights dimmed to a soft hum. Henry remained at his desk, poring over the same proposal he had presented earlier, though the lines of text had begun to blur. Outside the window, the city lights glittered, promising a world of activity beyond the confines of his work. A knock on the doorframe startled him. It was Olivia, a senior colleague from marketing, her sharp suit softened by a genuine smile. She leaned against the door, her casual ease a stark contrast to the formal rigidity that dominated the bank's atmosphere. "Burning the midnight oil, Henry?" she asked, her voice warm. He chuckled softly, setting his pen down. "Something like that. Just trying to get this right." Olivia stepped closer, her heels clicking against the polished floor. "I saw you in the meeting today," she said. "I thought your proposal had a lot of merit." "Thanks," Henry replied, his tone cautious. Not everyone seemed to agree. She tilted her head, studying him. "Grayson doesn't like to be challenged. But that doesn't mean you're wrong. If you ever want ideas from someone, I'm here." Her offer caught Henry off guard, but he nodded, appreciating the gesture. As she turned to leave, she paused. "Oh, before I forget, Grayson's hosting a dinner tomorrow night. A little networking event for the senior staff. He asked me to extend the invitation to you." Henry hesitated, his grip tightening on the edge of his desk. "I didn't realize I was on the guest list." Olivia smiled knowingly. "Maybe you weren't at first, but you are now. Think about it." After she left, Henry sat back in his chair, the invitation weighing heavily on him. He knew the unspoken rules of these gatherings. They were as much about subtle power plays as they were about networking. But an invitation was an opportunity, and opportunities weren't something he could afford to ignore. The next evening, Henry arrived at Grayson's stately home in the suburbs, a sprawling property framed by manicured lawns and hedges trimmed with precision. He smoothed his jacket, his palms damp with a nervous energy he couldn't shake. Inside, the atmosphere buzzed with polite laughter and the clink of glasses. The room was filled with familiar faces, each person navigating the space with a practiced ease that spoke of long-standing familiarity. Henry spotted Grayson across the room, holding court among a group of executives. As Henry approached the group, Grayson glanced over, his smile tightening slightly before he stepped forward. "Sullivan," he said, extending a hand. "Glad you could make it." "Thank you for the invitation," Henry replied, his tone measured. Grayson nodded, then gestured toward the others. "Have you met Brad and Angela? They were just telling me about a new client they've been courting." Henry exchanged pleasantries, but the conversation quickly turned inward, the group speaking in shorthand about deals and partnerships he hadn't been privy to. He lingered at the edge, his contributions measured but often overlooked. The evening wore on, and Henry found himself drifting toward the back of the room, seeking a moment of reprieve. He stood near a window, watching the lights of the city in the distance, when Olivia joined him. "Surviving?" she asked, her tone light. "Just about," Henry replied, offering a faint smile. She followed his gaze to the city lights. "It's a tough crowd, she admitted, but don't let it get to you. They respect results more than anything else. Before Henry could respond, Grayson approached, a glass of wine in hand. "Ah, Sullivan," he said, his voice carrying that practiced tone of congeniality. "I've been meaning to ask. What's your take on the new client policy Angela mentioned earlier?" Henry hesitated. He hadn't been included in that particular conversation. But he offered a thoughtful response based on what he knew. Grayson listened, his expression unreadable, then nodded. "Interesting perspective," he said before turning back to Olivia. Henry felt the dismissal keenly. Though he kept his expression neutral, he was used to the subtle ways power and belonging were communicated. Through who was invited to speak, whose ideas were entertained, and whose presence was merely tolerated. As the night wound down, Henry found himself in the kitchen, away from the din of the main room. He needed a moment to collect himself before heading home. A server offered him a drink, and he accepted it with a polite nod. Moments later, Brad entered, his voice boisterous. "Hiding out, Sullivan?" he asked. A grin plastered across his face. Henry smiled faintly, just stepping away for a moment. Brad leaned against the counter, swirling his glass. "You know," he said, his tone taking on a conspiratorial edge. "I've been in this game a long time. You've got potential, but you have to learn to play it right. Don't push too hard." Henry's smile tightened. "I'll keep that in mind." Brad clapped him on the shoulder before heading back to the party, leaving Henry alone in the quiet of the kitchen. The air felt heavier now, the unspoken hierarchies of the evening pressing down on him. As he left Grayson's home that night, Henry walked to his car with a measured step. The evening had been a study in contrasts, the polite veneer of inclusion masking the deeper currents of exclusion. Back in his apartment, Henry sat in the quiet, replaying the moments of the night. The tension, the subtle slights, the unspoken rules, all of it painted a picture of a world that demanded more of him than it did of others. And yet, he knew he couldn't let it deter him. There was work to be done, and Henry was determined to do it, even if it meant navigating the invisible walls that stood in his way. The next morning, Henry arrived at the office earlier than usual. The city streets were quieter at this hour, the morning light just beginning to stretch across the buildings. He liked the stillness, the sense of a day not yet shaped. It was a moment to gather himself before stepping into the labyrinth of corporate life. As he walked into the lobby, the security guard at the front desk, James, nodded in greeting. "Morning, Mr. Sullivan," he said with a small smile. "Morning, James," Henry replied, returning the smile. The elevator doors slid open, revealing a nearly empty car save for two occupants, Angela, one of the senior executives, and a man in a maintenance uniform carrying a toolkit. "Good morning," Henry said as he stepped inside. Angela offered a polite nod, while the maintenance worker kept his gaze down. The ride began in silence, the faint hum of the elevator filling the space. After a few floors, the elevator jolted slightly, then stopped. The lights flickered once before settling into a dim glow. "Of course," Angela muttered, exasperated. She pressed the emergency button, but there was no immediate response. The maintenance worker, whose name tag read Luis, crouched down to open a panel on the wall. "Looks like the system tripped," he said, his voice steady. "I can reset it, but it might take a few minutes." Angela sighed, crossing her arms. "Wonderful," she said, her tone dripping with impatience. Henry glanced at Luis. "Do you need help?" Luis shook his head. "I've got it, thanks." As Luis worked, Angela shifted her weight, her irritation evident. "This is why I always take the stairs when I can," she said, more to herself than anyone else. "It's faster and less unpredictable." Henry noted the way her gaze flickered toward Luis, her words hanging in the air like an unfinished thought. Luis didn't respond, his focus on the panel. But Henry caught the way his shoulders tensed, the way he worked a little faster, as if to avoid the weight of Angela's scrutiny. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The air in the elevator grew heavier, not just from the confined space but from the unspoken tension. Angela checked her phone repeatedly, muttering under her breath about missed emails and wasted time. "Do you always carry tools with you?" she asked Luis. Her tone clipped. "Part of the job," Luis replied simply, not looking up. Angela made a small noise of acknowledgement, though it lacked sincerity. "I suppose it's useful to have someone who can fix things on hand." Henry felt a flicker of irritation. The remark was innocuous on the surface, but there was an edge to it. A quiet dismissal wrapped in polite indifference. "You know," Henry said, his voice calm, "it's impressive how you can troubleshoot something like this so quickly. I wouldn't know where to start." Luis glanced at him, a faint smile breaking his otherwise focused expression. "It's just experience," he said. "You learn to handle things when they come up." Angela shifted again, checking her phone. "I hope that experience includes getting us out of here soon," she said lightly, though her words carried a sharper undertone. Eventually, the elevator whirred back to life, and Luis stood, wiping his hands on a cloth. "Should be good now," he said. The doors opened to a hallway, and Angela stepped out immediately, her heels clicking against the floor. "About time," she said, her tone dismissive. Henry stayed behind for a moment. "Thanks for getting us moving," he said to Luis. Louis nodded. "No problem, just part of the job." But as Henry walked down the hall toward his office, the interaction stayed with him. It wasn't just Angela's impatience or the way she had spoken to Luis. It was the deeper undercurrent of the exchange. The way her words had placed a quiet wall between herself and the man who had just solved the problem. The rest of the day passed in a blur of meetings and emails. But Henry couldn't shake the memory of the elevator ride. He thought about how easily those moments of dismissal and condescension slipped into daily life. Unnoticed by most but keenly felt by those on the receiving end. In the evening, as he packed up his things, he glanced out the window at the city below. The world kept moving, indifferent to the small slights and quiet injustices that unfolded within it. But Henry knew better than to ignore them. He had lived them, felt them, and seen their impact. They weren't just moments to move past. They were cracks in the foundation, reminders of the work still to be done. As he left the office, the weight of the day settled over him. Yet beneath it was a quiet resolve, a determination to navigate these spaces with intention, to see what others refused to acknowledge. Because someone had to. Henry entered the conference room feeling the weight of the day already pressing against his chest. The weekly strategy meeting was a staple of corporate life, one where decisions were made, and hierarchies reinforced. The room smelled faintly of coffee and ambition, a mix that never failed to make him uneasy. The table was polished, the kind of surface that reflected not just the room's lighting but the unspoken rules governing it. Around it sat the familiar faces of the company's leadership, executives in tailored suits, each with their carefully curated personas. At the head of the table, Mark Thompson, the CEO, adjusted his cufflinks with the ease of someone accustomed to being listened to. Henry took his usual seat near the middle, not too close to the head but not relegated to the periphery either. It was a position he had learned to navigate carefully, a subtle balance that allowed him to speak without overshadowing or being overshadowed. Across from him sat Rachel, the head of marketing, her smile as sharp as her ideas. Beside her, David, the CFO, tapped on his tablet, already deep in calculations. Next to Henry was Sarah, a junior analyst who had joined the company only 6 months ago. She glanced at him nervously, her pen poised over a blank notebook. "All right," Mark began, his voice demanding immediate attention. "Let's dive in." The meeting unfolded with a familiar rhythm, each department head presenting updates and proposals. But as the conversation turned to the company's upcoming diversity initiative, the atmosphere shifted. It wasn't overt, but Henry could feel it. A slight tightening of posture, a faint change in tone. Mark leaned forward, his fingers steepled. "We've been talking a lot about diversity," he said, his words carefully measured, "but we need to make sure we're striking the right balance. We don't want to alienate anyone." Alienate anyone. The phrase hung in the air, vague yet pointed. Henry's jaw tightened imperceptibly. He knew what it meant. It was the kind of language used to soften resistance while maintaining the status quo. Rachel nodded, her voice smooth. "Exactly. It's about making sure our messaging is inclusive without being too divisive." "Divisive for whom?" Henry asked, his tone even but firm. The room went still for a moment, the attention shifting to him. Mark's gaze flicked to Henry, his expression unreadable. "It's about ensuring everyone feels represented," he said. Henry held his gaze. "But representation doesn't mean compromise. It means being honest about who we are and who we want to include." "That's not divisive. That's progress." The silence that followed was brief but heavy. Rachel cleared her throat, a polite deflection. Of course, but we also need to be practical. We can't risk alienating long-standing clients. Henry looked at her, his voice calm but carrying an edge. Clients who see diversity as a threat are already alienated. The question is whether we have the courage to stand for something. Across the table, David shifted uncomfortably, his fingers tapping against the tablet. We're also talking about risk here. He interjected. There's a financial component to consider. There always is, Henry replied, but the real risk is doing nothing. Ignoring the issue doesn't make it go away. It just makes us complicit. The conversation moved on, but the tension lingered. Henry could feel the unspoken resistance. The quiet discomfort that came with challenging deeply ingrained norms. He had seen it before. The subtle ways people deflected, reframed, and redirected conversations to avoid the deeper truths. After the meeting, as people gathered their things and filed out, Sarah lingered. She hesitated for a moment before speaking. That was bold, she said, her voice low. Henry glanced at her, offering a faint smile. Boldness is just honesty with a little risk. She nodded, her expression thoughtful. I'm glad you said it. Later that evening, Henry sat at his desk, the city lights casting long shadows across the room. The meeting replayed in his mind. Each interaction, each word dissected. He thought about the resistance he had felt, the quiet walls that had gone up the moment he had spoken. It wasn't just about one meeting or one initiative. It was about the larger battle. The ongoing tension between progress and preservation, between change and comfort, and it was exhausting. But as he looked out at the city, its streets alive with movement and possibility, he reminded himself of the importance of the fight. The struggle was not just his. It was shared, woven into the fabric of lives and stories that came before him and would follow after. With a deep breath, Henry turned back to his work. There was more to do. Always more. But for now, he allowed himself a moment of quiet resolve. A reminder that every seat at the table was earned, not given, and that was worth everything. The cafe was a place of habit, where the rhythm of clinking coffee cups and murmured conversation created a kind of comforting anonymity. Henry sat at his usual table near the window. A paperback spread open in front of him. The book was more a prop than a companion. His thoughts were too restless to focus on its words. Across the room, a man in a navy suit sipped an espresso while scrolling on his phone. A group of college students laughed at something on one of their screens. Two older women in pastel sweaters whispered over steaming mugs. It was the kind of setting that gave the illusion of peace. A tableau where lives intersected briefly but rarely collided. Until they did. It started quietly, almost imperceptibly, a momentary tension that rippled through the room like a stone dropped into still water. Henry looked up from his book to see a young black man standing at the counter. He was dressed simply in a hoodie and jeans, his hands shoved into his pockets as he studied the menu board. The barista, a middle-aged woman with a tired smile, greeted him. "Can I help you? I'll take a latte, please," the man said, his voice polite but subdued. As the transaction unfolded, Henry noticed the shift in the room. The man in the navy suit glanced up, his gaze lingering on the young man a second too long before returning to his phone. The two women stopped whispering, their eyes darting toward the counter. Even the laughter from the college students seemed to fade into an uneasy silence. Henry recognized the moment for what it was. Not a confrontation, but a quiet, collective act of suspicion. It was the kind of moment he had seen too many times before, where the weight of judgment hung heavy in the air, unspoken but undeniable. When the young man turned to find a seat, the tension followed him like a shadow. He chose a table near the door, his movements careful, almost rehearsed. Henry watched as the man settled into his chair, his posture straight, his hands resting lightly on the table. It was a pose of deliberate nonchalance, a kind of armor against the unspoken accusations that seemed to press in from all sides. The man in the navy suit shifted in his chair, his phone forgotten as his gaze returned to the young man. One of the women at the nearby table leaned toward her companion, her voice low but audible. "He looks so young," she said. "I wonder if he's waiting for someone." Her companion nodded, her expression unreadable, or something. The words were innocuous enough on the surface, but Henry could hear the undercurrent, the quiet implication that the young man's presence was an anomaly, a question that demanded an answer. Henry closed his book and stood, crossing the room with deliberate steps. He paused at the counter to order another coffee before making his way to the young man's table. "Mind if I sit?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. The young man looked up, surprise flickering across his face before he nodded. "Sure." Henry slid into the chair across from him, setting his coffee on the table. "Name's Henry," he said, extending a hand. "Marcus," the young man replied, shaking it. The conversation started small, an exchange of pleasantries about the weather, the best coffee spots in town. But Henry was careful to keep his tone easy, his words inviting. He wanted Marcus to feel seen, not scrutinized, to know that he wasn't alone in the room's quiet hostility. As they talked, Henry could feel the eyes on them, the way the room's attention seemed to coalesce around their table. It was a subtle but unmistakable shift, the kind that made the unspoken divide feel suddenly stark. Eventually, Marcus glanced at his watch and stood. "I should get going," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "Thanks for the company." "Anytime," Henry replied, meeting his gaze. "Take care of yourself." As Marcus left the cafe, the tension in the room seemed to dissipate, replaced by the familiar hum of conversation and clinking cups. But for Henry, the moment lingered, a reminder of the insidious ways prejudice could manifest, not in grand gestures but in the smallest interactions. That evening, as Henry walked home, he thought about Marcus and the countless others who moved through spaces like the cafe, carrying the weight of judgment on their shoulders. It wasn't just about coffee shops or casual glances. It was about the larger pattern, the way these moments accumulated, shaping lives in ways that were often invisible to those who didn't bear their burden. It was a quiet kind of violence, Henry realized, one that didn't leave bruises but left scars all the same. As he reached his building, Henry paused at the door, looking back at the street. The city stretched out before him, its lights flickering like distant stars. He knew that the fight against these moments wouldn't be won in a single day or a single conversation. But as he stepped inside, he carried with him the resolve to keep pushing back, one moment at a time. The autumn air carried a crispness that seemed to sharpen the city's edges, making every sound and movement more vivid. Henry walked to the community center, his steps deliberate but unhurried. The building loomed ahead, a worn brick structure that had seen better days, its facade marked by decades of use and neglect. Inside, the hum of conversation spilled out into the street, a symphony of voices blending together in an uneven but hopeful harmony. Henry had been coming here for months, volunteering his evenings to mentor young adults navigating the complexities of a world that often seemed indifferent to their struggles. It was a place of connection, a space carved out for those who needed it most. Yet tonight, as he opened the door, the atmosphere felt different, heavier. The group was already gathered in the multi-purpose room, a circle of chairs filled with familiar faces. Marcus, the young man Henry had met at the cafe, was there, his posture as guarded as ever. Beside him sat Kayla, an outspoken college student who always spoke with a fervor that bordered on defiance. Across from her was Darnell, a quiet man in his 40s who rarely spoke but whose presence carried an undeniable gravity. Henry took his seat, offering a warm nod to the group. "Good to see everyone," he began, his voice steady. "Let's check in. How's everyone doing this week?" The responses were varied, a mix of highs and lows that painted a mosaic of lives in motion. Marcus spoke about a job interview that had left him feeling scrutinized. Kayla recounted a heated debate in her sociology class. And Darnell, as always, offered little more than a shrug. Then, midway through the check-in, the door opened. A man in a uniform stepped inside, his presence drawing every eye in the room. Officer Jameson, a local beat cop, had been assigned to the community center as part of an outreach program. Though his visits were ostensibly about building trust, his arrival always seemed to have the opposite effect. "Evening, folks," Jameson said, his tone overly familiar. He leaned against the wall, his hands resting casually on his belt. "Just here to observe." The tension in the room was palpable, a silent unease that Henry could feel in his chest. Jameson's presence was like a spotlight, highlighting the invisible lines that separated the group from the world outside. He wasn't overtly threatening, his smile was practiced, his words polite, but his uniform carried a weight that couldn't be ignored. Kayla was the first to speak. "Observe what, exactly?" she asked, her tone sharp. "We're just talking." Jameson's smile faltered, but only for a moment. I'm here to support the community, he said, to show we're all on the same side. Kayla's laugh was bitter. Funny. It doesn't always feel that way. Henry interjected before the tension could escalate further. Officer Jameson, he said, his voice calm but firm. We appreciate your intention, but tonight's conversation is for the group. You're welcome to stay, but I'd ask that you listen rather than participate. Jameson hesitated, his gaze flickering around the room. Then he nodded. Fair enough, he said, moving to a corner where he leaned against the wall, his eyes scanning the group. As the discussion resumed, the topics grew more pointed. Marcus shared an experience from earlier in the week when a shopkeeper had followed him through a store. His every movement shadowed by suspicion. I wasn't doing anything wrong, Marcus said, his voice trembling with a mix of anger and exhaustion. But it didn't matter. He looked at me like I didn't belong. Kayla nodded fiercely. That's what I mean, she said. They don't need to say it out loud. It's in their eyes, their actions. They've already decided who we are. Darnell, who had been silent until now, spoke up. It's not just them deciding, he said, his voice low but steady. It's us, too, deciding how much of it we're willing to carry. His words hung in the air, heavy with truth. The group fell into a contemplative silence, the weight of shared experience pressing down on them. Jameson shifted uncomfortably in his corner, his presence now a glaring reminder of the divide the group was grappling with. Henry glanced at him, considering his next move. Then he spoke, his voice gentle but resolute. Officer Jameson, he said, I'd like to ask you something. What does trust mean to you? Jameson looked startled by the question. He straightened up, clearing his throat. It's about mutual respect, he said, knowing that we're working toward the same goals. Henry nodded slowly. And do you think trust can exist when one side holds all the power? The room went still, every pair of eyes now fixed on Jameson. He shifted again, his confidence faltering. I think trust takes time, he said finally. It takes effort. Effort, Kayla repeated, her tone biting. How much effort does it take to stop looking at us like we're criminals? Kayla, Henry said gently, placing a hand on her arm. Let's give him a chance to answer. Jameson opened his mouth, then closed it again. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken truths. Finally, he said, I'm here because I want to understand. I know I can't change the past, but I'm trying to do better. The conversation that followed was raw and unfiltered, a painful but necessary reckoning. The group shared their stories, their fears, and their frustrations, while Jameson listened, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. By the end of the evening, the air in the room felt different. Not lighter, exactly, but less fraught. There was no resolution, no grand epiphany, but there was something else. A crack in the wall, a sliver of possibility. As the group dispersed, Henry lingered behind, watching as Jameson approached Marcus. They exchanged a few quiet words before Jameson extended a hand. Marcus hesitated, then shook it, his expression guarded but not unkind. Henry left the center that night with a strange mix of hope and weariness. The challenges they faced were immense, the divides seemingly insurmountable, but in that room, for those few hours, they had begun to bridge the gap. Not with answers, but with questions. Not with solutions, but with understanding. And sometimes, Henry thought, that was enough to keep going. The sky was painted in muted grays as Henry stepped out of the subway station. The city seemed to mirror his mood, somber and reflective. He clutched his coat tighter against the biting wind as he made his way toward the neighborhood library. Tonight's meeting wasn't at the community center, it was in this small, unassuming building, a space with its own quiet power. The library's meeting room was modest, with mismatched chairs and walls lined with faded posters promoting literacy and community programs. The table at the center was cluttered with coffee cups and notepads, evidence of the many conversations that had taken place here over the years. Henry arrived early, as he often did, and took a seat near the window. He stared out at the street, the city's pulse faint but persistent. One by one, the others began to arrive. Marcus entered first, his usual guarded demeanor slightly softened. Behind him came Kayla, her energy subdued but no less present. Darnell followed, nodding at Henry before taking his seat. The room filled slowly, each person carrying their own unspoken stories, their own burdens. As the last of the group settled in, Henry stood, his voice cutting through the low hum of conversation. "Thank you all for being here tonight," he began. "This is our final meeting in this space. At least for now. I wanted us to reflect on where we've been. And where we're going." The room fell silent. Henry looked at each face, seeing not just individuals but the collective weight they bore. "We've talked about the systems that shape our lives," he continued. "The ones that divide us, confine us, make us question our worth. But tonight, I want to talk about something else. The silences we carry. The ones that weigh us down, even when we don't realize it." Kayla shifted in her seat, her eyes narrowing. "You mean the things we don't say because we're too afraid to rock the boat?" Henry nodded. "Exactly. Silence can be a shield, but it can also be a prison. And sometimes, the hardest thing to confront isn't what others say. It's what we've left unsaid." The group exchanged uneasy glances. It was Marcus who broke the tension, his voice hesitant. "There's a man who works at the corner store near my apartment," he said. "Every time I walk in, he follows me like I'm about to steal something. I've never said anything to him. I just let it happen." Kayla leaned forward, her tone sharp. "Why? Why not call him out?" Marcus's gaze dropped to the table. "Because what's the point? I don't want to be that guy. The one who's always angry. Always fighting." Henry placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder. "You're not wrong to feel that way. But sometimes, silence is its own kind of fight. It's the battle we wage with ourselves, wondering if speaking up is worth the cost." The conversation deepened, each person sharing moments of silence that had lingered with them. Kayla spoke of a professor who dismissed her ideas in class, her voice cracking with frustration. "I wanted to tell him off," she said, "but I stayed quiet because I didn't want to be labeled the angry black woman." Darnell, who had been listening intently, finally spoke. "I worked at a factory for 20 years. He said. Every time I got passed over for a promotion, I told myself it was just bad luck. But I knew it wasn't. I stayed quiet because I needed that job. My family needed me to keep my head down." The weight of their words filled the room, each story adding another layer to the tapestry of shared experience. Henry let the silence linger, giving it space to breathe before he spoke again. "Silence can feel safe," he said, "but it also keeps us from being seen, from showing the world, and ourselves, who we really are." The group sat in reflective silence for a moment before Kayla spoke up, her voice steady but resolute. "So what do we do? How do we break the silence without losing ourselves in the process?" Henry smiled faintly. "We start small," he said. "We pick moments. Not every battle needs to be fought. But some do. And when we choose to speak, we do it with clarity. With purpose. Not just for ourselves, but for the people who come after us." The evening stretched on, the conversation shifting between hope and doubt, fear and resolve. By the time they left the library, the city was cloaked in darkness, its streets illuminated by the soft glow of streetlights. The group dispersed, each person carrying with them the echoes of the night's discussion. Henry lingered on the steps of the library, watching as Marcus and Kayla walked down the street, their voices low but animated. Darnell paused at the corner, turning back to give Henry a small nod before disappearing into the night. For a long moment, Henry stood alone, the city's hum wrapping around him like a second skin. He thought about the silences he had carried over the years, the words he had swallowed, the battles he had chosen not to fight. But he also thought about the moments when he had spoken up, when his voice had cut through the noise and made someone pause, reflect, reconsider. As he turned to leave, Henry felt a quiet determination settle over him. The work was far from over. The weight of silence was not easily lifted, and the path ahead was steep. But tonight had been a step, a small, steady step towards something better. And for now, that was enough.